Hi, I'm going to do a bit of talk on renal physiology, just the basic of renal physiology, and we'll try to do a couple of short talks. So, we all talk about GFR. So, normally GFR 125 ml per minute translates into 180 liter of urine filtered at the level of glomeruli, and yet we pee out only 2 liter. So, why do the tubules reabsorb all that water? Is it because the tubular cells are hungry for water? The answer is no. The tubular cells basically are hungry for sodium, and as you know, water goes wherever sodium goes. So out of that 180 liter of urine filtered at the level of glomeruli, 99% of the water is reabsorbed, and out of that 99%, 95% water reabsorbed because it follows sodium, and 4 to 5% of the water or the urine is reabsorbed by ADH, and that's independent of sodium. So the question is, why are the tubular cells hungry for sodium? And the answer is, let's say this is our nephron lined by the tubular cells. All the tubular cells, and it's not just the tubular cells, every cell in our body is actually negative. So they crave for positive things, A, and B, every cell in our body is also low in sodium. But why is that so? So if I were to look at any cell, let's say I picked up this cell. This is the tubular lumen, and this is facing the interstitium. On the basal side, every cell in our body has sodium, potassium, ATPase, which chucks 3 sodium out of the cell and pulls 2 potassium into the cell. So every cell in our body is constantly throwing out 3 sodium and pulling in 2 potassium. So the net result is A, they lost 3 positive but gain only 2 positive, so they're negative. The second thing is they lost sodium, so they're low in sodium. The third thing is they are high in potassium. So remember that applies to every cell in your body. So, and this applies more so on the tubular cells than any other cell in the body, in fact. So because the tubular cells are so hungry for sodium, they keep reabsorbing sodium, and as they reabsorb sodium, water follows the sodium, and that's how we reabsorb 95% of the water. The remaining 4 to 5% is reabsorbed under the influence of ADH, and that's independent of sodium. So if I were to split up this nephron into different parts, in the proximal convoluted tubule, we reabsorbed about 60 to 70% of the water. In the loop, we reabsorb about 25 to 30%. In the distal convoluted tubule, we reabsorb about 5 to 10%. And here, we reabsorb about, as I said, 4 to 5% under the influence of ADH. And this is additional 1 to 2% of sodium reabsorption, which leads to an extra 1 to 2% of water reabsorption. I'll come to that. So I hope that makes sense so far. So GFR 125 ml per minute, we make 180 liter of urine at the level of glomeruli, and we reabsorb 99% of that. So we urinate only 2 liters. Why do we reabsorb it? Because the tubular cells are hungry for sodium. So 95% of that water is reabsorbed because water blindly follows sodium. Why are the tubular cells hungry for sodium? Because it's not just the tubular cell, but every cell in our body is always negative, is always low in sodium, because every cell in the body on the basolateral side has sodium, potassium, ATPase, which throws 3 sodium out of the cell, pulls 2 potassium into the cell. So the net result is all cells are A, low in sodium, B, high in potassium, and C, they are negative because they lost 3 sodium and gained only 2 potassium. So therefore these cells keep reabsorbing sodium, and as they reabsorb sodium, water follows. An extra 4 to 5% of the water reabsorption is independent of sodium, and that's under the influence of ADH, and we'll come to that later. And also in the collecting duct, we have, so 60 to 70% of the total sodium reabsorption and water reabsorption happens in the PCT. About 25 to 30% of the reabsorption happens in the loop. 5 to 10% reabsorption happens in the distal convoluted tubule, and 1 to 2% of sodium and therefore water reabsorption happens in the same manner in the collecting duct. But as I said, an extra 4 to 5% of water reabsorption independent of sodium happens because of ADH. So now you can see why loop diuretic is more potent than thiazide diuretic, because here is where you get 25 to 30% of water reabsorption, whereas only 5 to 10% of water reabsorption happens in the DCT. And also you can see why spironolactone is less potent than either of these, because spironolactone acts here, and here we get only 1 to 2% of the total sodium reabsorption. Now, which also brings me back to the fact that every diuretic acts by the mechanistic principle of inhibiting sodium reabsorption, and that's it. Diuretics do not care about your water. So loop diuretic will inhibit sodium reabsorption here, thiazide diuretic will inhibit sodium reabsorption here, and spironolactone will inhibit sodium reabsorption here. So a bit more about the spironolactone. So spironolactone, as you know, is the aldosterone antagonist. So if I were to draw just this cell over here, so let's say I've drawn this cell in the collecting duct over here. So this is the urinary lumen, and this is the interstitium with the vasa recta and the blood cells, the blood supply. So on the basolateral side, they have aldosterone receptor. So what aldosterone does is aldosterone comes and hooks itself here on the basal side, and then it does two things. First, it activates the sodium potassium ATPase to work extra hard. So what does sodium potassium ATPase do? It throws sodium out of the cells and pulls potassium into the cell. So because aldosterone hooking onto the aldosterone receptor causes sodium potassium ATPase to work extra hard, the cells lose more sodium. So therefore the cells in the collecting duct are more hungry for sodium. That's half the story. The other half the story is here is ENaC, which is basically the sodium channel through which sodium from the urinary lumen enters the cell. What aldosterone does is it keeps the ENaC channel wide open. It keeps it more open, so more sodium comes in. So end result is aldosterone causes more sodium to enter. So that 1 to 2% of, on top of whatever the tubular cell would have reabsorbed sodium anyway, aldosterone causes an extra 1 to 2% of sodium reabsorption, and water follows sodium. But then what happens is, as aldosterone does this, the urine in the lumen gets mad at aldosterone and says, okay, you've taken a lot of sodium away, I need something positive in return. So the aldosterone looks at the cells and says, okay, the cells, as you know, are high in potassium because of the sodium potassium ATPase. So aldosterone directly kicks potassium out into the urinary lumen. So we throw some potassium into the urinary lumen. Now the urine says, okay, you've taken a lot of my positively charged sodium, you've given me some potassium, but you've not given me enough. So I think aldosterone reabsorbs more sodium than it kicks out potassium. So the urine is still mad at aldosterone and says, I need more positive things. And aldosterone is really not sure of what to do. 90% of the cells in the collecting duct are what we call as principal cells, which basically help to, on which aldosterone can work. 10% of the cells here are not principal cells. They are intercalated cells. So intercalated cells are of two types, alpha and beta. Alpha intercalated cell is rich in hydrogen, beta is rich in bicarbonate. I'm not concerned about beta cells. Alpha intercalated cells, which are rich in positively charged hydrogen, being the good neighbor, tell aldosterone that, look, you've taken a lot of positively charged sodium and you have not given enough potassium in return. I've got some positive hydrogen, so I'll just chuck it into the urine. So therefore, direct effect of aldosterone is sodium reabsorption and water indirectly follows. Direct effect of aldosterone is potassium excretion, and indirect effect of aldosterone is hydrogen excretion. So now you can see, when I put people on spironolactone and I antagonize aldosterone, I'm stopping sodium from being reabsorbed and water from being reabsorbed. That's a diuretic effect. But I'm also stopping potassium and hydrogen from being excreted. So I can become hyperkalemic and I can become acidotic. Whereas when I'm on loop diuretic and thiazide diuretic, as they stop, inhibit the reabsorption of sodium, the urine now is full of sodium. It goes to the collecting duct, and the collecting duct will say, okay, I'm the last man standing of the nephron and the body is losing too much sodium. So I must heroically salvage some of them. So these cells will reabsorb that sodium because they see this urine is full of sodium. But as they do that, they start to turn positive and they are going to die if they turn positive. So the cells say, okay, I got to lose some positive stuff. And the main positive ion inside the cell is potassium. So they'll kick potassium out. So therefore, when people are on big doses of furosemide or thiazide diuretics, you often see them running hypokalemic. That's half the story. The other half of the story is when you put them on diuretics, their volume contracted, which leads to activation of renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. As you know, hypovolemia causes renin, angiotensin, aldosterone activation. So therefore they make a lot of aldosterone, and as we said, aldosterone directly kicks out potassium and indirectly kicks out hydrogen. So people on furosemide thiazide diuretic are often hypokalemic and alkalotic. People on spironolactone are often hyperkalemic and acidotic. I hope that makes sense. I'll stop here and I'll come back for the second talk and touch some other parts of the kidney. Thank you so much.